Welcome to the quiet charm of the Cotswolds, where the teapots never cool and the secrets never quite stay buried. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Do tell us in the comments below. And if these cozy mysteries keep you company in the evenings, do subscribe. It helps us brew up the next case for you. Now then, shall we begin? Early spring had come to Carsley, which meant drizzle, defiance, and daffodils that looked as though they regretted the effort. Agatha Raisin stood in her garden, secateurs in hand, pruning her roses with unnecessary aggression. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and irritation. "You're taking it out on the innocent," murmured Mrs. Bloxby, who had wandered over from the vicarage gate, clutching a modest bunch of snowdrops. "Roses are never innocent," said Agatha. "They lure you in with scent and stab you when you're not looking, rather like men." Mrs. Bloxby smiled the mild smile of one who has seen storms and chooses not to stand under them. "Still, spring's coming, always a hopeful season." "Hopeful for weeds, perhaps," said Agatha, snipping viciously. It was at that moment the post arrived, one heavy cream envelope standing out among the bills like a swan among ducks. The handwriting was elegantly masculine, the wax seal a pretentious little crest. Agatha wiped her secateurs on her sleeve, slit the envelope with her nail file, and read aloud. "Sir Charles Frayth requests the pleasure of Mrs. Agatha Raisin's company at the Mayfair gala in aid of endangered gentlemen's clubs." She blinked. "Endangered what?" "It's some kind of charity," said Mrs. Bloxby kindly. "For elderly gentlemen, I imagine." "Then let them endanger themselves." Still, Agatha hesitated, feeling that familiar spark of vanity. London, chandeliers, and Charles. The Cotswolds suddenly seemed provincial, and her muddy gardening boots traitorous. Inside, she dialed Charles. He answered on the third ring, voice smooth as honey over brandy. "Darling Agatha, I was just thinking of you." "Rubbish. What's this invitation nonsense? And why do you want me paraded at some ridiculous event for decrepit clubmen?" "Because," he said, with a pause that was infuriatingly theatrical, "someone asked whether you'd be there." "Who?" "I promised not to say. A certain admirer. Tall, devastatingly charming, possibly fatal to the female constitution." Agatha's pulse quickened despite herself. "You're making it up." "Would I ever?" His laughter was silk over steel. "Wear something scandalous. It's for charity." She slammed the phone down, but not before muttering, "We'll see who's scandalous." Within the hour, she had booked a hair appointment in Evesham, ordered a new pair of heels online, and decided she'd never admit it was because of a certain admirer. The night of the gala unfolded like a film she hadn't been invited to star in, but intended to steal anyway. The Mayfair ballroom gleamed with chandeliers, their light glancing off silver trays and the polished egos of the rich. Agatha's dress, navy satin, slightly tighter than intended, caught approving glances. Charles, in immaculate evening wear, gave a mock bow. "You've outshone the decor," he murmured. "Don't flatter me. It'll cost you." "Nothing compared to what I've already spent on champagne." Agatha let herself bask in the attention. For once she felt dazzling, not provincial. Then she saw him, a man whose confidence filled the room before he even smiled. "Julian Fenton," said Charles quietly. "Art dealer. Bit of a charmer. The one who asked after you." Julian approached, glass in hand, eyes the colour of mischief. "Mrs. Raisin, I presume. I was told you were formidable." They understated the case. "Flattery works only on the weak-minded," she said, trying not to blush. "Then I'm in dreadful danger." They danced, badly in Agatha's case, but with enthusiasm, and talked about art, travel, and the relative merits of London versus the Cotswolds. Agatha pretended sophistication and drank too quickly. Julian pretended interest and didn't need to. He had that easy polish that made everyone else feel a little shabby. "Dinner next week?" he asked. "If I can find my diary." "Lose it," he said with a grin. Charles watched them from the champagne table, his smile amused, though there was something behind it, an odd restraint. When Agatha caught his eye, he raised his glass and looked away. A week later, Agatha stood in the Mayfair restaurant where they'd agreed to meet. The table was laid, the candle lit, the wine already poured. Julian was nowhere to be seen. She checked her watch, then her phone, then her reflection. "Perhaps he's caught in traffic," murmured the waiter. "Perhaps he's been abducted," she snapped. After 40 minutes and 2 bread rolls, she admitted defeat. Outside, the London night smelled of exhaust and disappointment. The restaurant windows glowed behind her like mockery. She rang Charles. No answer, she muttered. Back at her modest hotel, the receptionist looked sympathetic. Men like that, they never vanish without reason. No, they vanish with reason, Agatha replied grimly. Usually one they invented themselves. Still, she couldn't let it go. Something in Julian's easy charm had felt genuine, or cleverly counterfeit. Either way, it itched. She phoned his gallery. No reply. She tried again the next morning and got a recorded message. Temporarily closed for refurbishment. By noon, she'd visited the address in person. The windows were dark, the brass nameplate polished but impersonal. The neighbour, a dry old gentleman with a lapdog, leaned over his railing. "Looking for Mr. Fenton? Police were here yesterday. Terrible business. Some nonsense about missing property. He owes half of Mayfair, they say." "What sort of property?" "Art, paintings, and something about a lady's bracelet. Emeralds, I think. Quite the scandal." Agatha's heart thudded. She felt foolish for caring, then angrier still for feeling foolish. She rang Charles again. This time he answered. "Ah, Aggie. Survived the metropolis, did you?" "Don't call me Aggie, and don't play innocent. Your friend Julian's vanished." "Julian? Gone? Well, that's rather his specialty. He's been vanishing from creditors for years. Surely you didn't—" "I didn't what? Loan him money?" "Of course not. I barely knew the man." "Then consider yourself lucky, and come home before London eats you alive." "Don't patronize me, Charles Fraith. If he's in trouble, I'll find out why." "You can't possibly mean to—" But she'd already hung up. That evening, she returned to the empty restaurant, as though habit might make him appear. The waiter looked startled. "Table for 2 again, madam." "Just 1, she said. "But bring a large wine, the tragic kind." The place hummed with other people's laughter. Agatha sat amid the clink of glass and silver, feeling the absurdity of it all. Around her, couples leaned close, whispering. She imagined Julian at one of those tables, smooth, smiling with someone else. A middle-aged man at the bar was staring at her with faint recognition. She straightened her shoulders, ready to confront him, but he turned away. Paranoia, she told herself. Still, she left a few minutes later, walking quickly through the drizzle. The city lights blurred in puddles, her heels clicking on wet pavement. For all her bravado, something uneasy fluttered beneath her irritation, the faint sense that she'd stumbled into a story without knowing its plot. Back in her hotel room, she kicked off her shoes and stared at her reflection. Mascara slightly smudged, pride thoroughly so. She poured herself the last of the minibar gin and muttered aloud, "If he thinks he can ghost me, he's in for a resurrection." Then she switched off the lamp, determined that tomorrow she'd begin the hunt, not for love, but for an explanation. Though, being Agatha, she'd never quite admit the difference. It was raining again in Carsley, not the romantic kind that made poets sigh, but the flat grey drizzle that discouraged even ducks. Agatha Raisin sat in her cottage kitchen, nursing a mug of instant coffee and recounting, with increasing theatricality, the entire saga of her London humiliation to Mrs. Bloxby. "Honestly, Margaret, if men were a species of wildlife, I'd join the conservation effort purely to be sure they stayed endangered," she declared. Mrs. Bloxby, whose patience was as famous as her Victoria sponge, smiled gently. "Perhaps you should simply rest, Agatha. A quiet week at home might do you good." "Rest? I've had enough rest to last a lifetime. What I need is justice." "For what, dear?" "For being made a fool of, again." Agatha jabbed her spoon into the sugar bowl with such force it snapped clean in 2. Mrs. Bloxby did not flinch. "You know," she said mildly, "sometimes when people vanish there are complicated reasons." "Yes, usually involving another woman or the police." She wasn't far wrong. The next morning brought both in the form of Sergeant Bill Wong, who appeared at her door wearing the expression of a man approaching a ticking device. "Morning, Agatha. You've heard about Julian Fenton, I suppose?" "Heard about him? I could write the definitive biography. Charming, deceitful, and probably allergic to punctuality. Why?" "His name's come up in an art fraud inquiry," said Bill. "A small portrait sold under questionable provenance. Thought you might have known something." Agatha bristled. Are you implying I consort with criminals? You consorted with him, didn't you? That was different. That was pre-vanishing. Bill sighed, just asking if he ever mentioned a painting. Agatha hesitated, remembering Julian's careless talk at the gala about a private collection that could change everything. She tried to sound detached, only that he handled fine art, nothing unusual for a dealer, surely. Bill took out his notebook, scribbled something, and said mildly, "All right, just let me know if anything comes to mind. And Agatha, please don't get involved." "Don't be ridiculous, I'm far too busy." She waited precisely 30 seconds after he left before dialing Charles. He answered on the second ring. "Aggie, my radiant investigator, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "Don't Aggie me. What do you know about Julian Fenton and an art fraud?" There was the faint clink of a glass at his end. Good heavens, has he finally annoyed the police? I thought it was just creditors. "Don't play innocent. You introduced us." "Introduced, yes. Endorsed, no. Why the sudden concern?" "Because the police think he's involved in something shady, and you sound suspiciously unconcerned." "My dear, concern is exhausting. Besides, I've always said Mayfair is a swamp. Charming from a distance, dreadful once you wade in." "You're hiding something," she said sharply. "Of course I am. It's the secret of my appeal." She hung up before she said something she'd regret. But by that afternoon, curiosity had dissolved all remaining dignity. She was on the motorway back to London, muttering that she was merely tidying up loose ends. The gallery on Brook Street stood silent, its elegant facade shuttered and forlorn. A notice in the window read "Closed for inventory," which Agatha immediately interpreted as closed for scandal. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. The door opened a crack, revealing a pale young man in an oversized cardigan who looked like he'd been living on caffeine and remorse. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Mrs. Raisin, She caught herself before saying a friend, "a former client of Mr. Fenton's. I was hoping to collect a piece he'd promised to show me." The assistant hesitated. "Mr. Fenton isn't available." "So I gathered. When will he be back?" "I couldn't say." "Because you don't know, or because you've been told not to?" The young man blinked rapidly, as if she'd spoken in algebra. "I think it best you contact his solicitor." "What's his name?" "I'm not sure he has one." "Then who's handling his affairs?" "The police, I believe." Agatha's stomach did a small, unwelcome flip. "Police?" "They were here yesterday. Something about missing documentation. I don't know the details." He started to close the door, but Agatha wedged her shoe into the gap, a risky move given the price of leather and her propensity for blisters. "Listen, I just want to collect a personal item he might have left behind. My name could be in his diary." That, at least, wasn't entirely untrue, though the word diary might have meant list of gullible women. "Wait here," he said nervously, disappearing inside. While he rummaged, Agatha glanced around the narrow hall visible through the gap. There were canvases leaning against walls, papers strewn across a desk, and a faint smell of turpentine and secrecy. On the floor near a small waste bin lay something scorched, a corner of heavy cream card, half burned. She bent, discreetly plucked it up, and examined what remained. An embossed crest, a stag's head, silver on deep blue. She recognized it instantly. Charles Fraith. Before she could pocket it, the assistant returned, empty-handed. "Nothing here under your name, Mrs. Raisin. Sorry." "You will be," she muttered, tucking the card fragment into her handbag. Outside, the London sky hung low and grim, the kind that made even taxis look melancholy. As she stood on the pavement, trying to decide whether she felt more betrayed or thrilled, a neighbour emerged from the adjoining doorway, a woman wrapped in a tartan shawl with the confident gloom of someone who knew everything and intended to tell it. "You're looking for Mr. Fenton, I expect," the woman said. "Police came day before yesterday, searched the place top to bottom." "Did they say why?" "Something about stolen art. I keep my own bits locked up now. Can't be too careful. Terrible business, though. He was a handsome one, the type who'd sell you the moon if it were on canvas." "Did he mention where he was going?" "Only that he wouldn't be coming back. Left in a dreadful hurry, night before the search. A gentleman was with him. Silver car, tinted windows. Looked posh." Agatha's pulse quickened. Did this gentleman have dark hair and an expression suggesting he'd rather die than work for a living? That's the one, said the neighbour. Charles. Agatha thanked her with forced politeness, then walked briskly down the street. The puddles reflected blurred faces and streaks of light, the city humming with that peculiar mix of wealth and deceit. She paused by the gallery window for one last look, her own reflection faintly doubled in the glass. That was when she saw him, a man in a dark coat standing across the road, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He appeared to be watching her. She turned sharply, heart thudding, but the pavement was empty. Only the hiss of tyres on wet tarmac and the glow of a street lamp remained. Agatha straightened her shoulders, muttering to herself, "It's probably nothing. But if Charles Frayth thinks he can keep secrets from me, he's got another thing coming." She walked away into the drizzle, her handbag heavier by one singed clue and a suspicion she couldn't yet name. London always looked its best when Agatha Raisin was in no mood to appreciate it. The afternoon sunlight turned Mayfair's stone terraces to gold. Taxis hummed politely in traffic, and Agatha, arms folded in the back of one of them, glowered at the city as though it had betrayed her personally. "Cheer up, darling," said Roy Silver from the seat beside her. "You're about to meet the most deliciously tragic woman in London. Think of the column inches." "Roy, I'm not here for gossip. I'm here for answers." "You always were sentimental about your men, even the ones who evaporate." Agatha shot him a look that could have curdled gin. "He didn't evaporate. He vanished. There's a difference." "One's poetic, the other's criminal." "Precisely." The taxi pulled up before a Georgian townhouse with polished brass and a discreet nameplate, Mrs. Clarissa Malvern. The place reeked of money that had stopped pretending to be modest. "She was married to the late Richard Malvern," said Roy, fluffing his scarf. "He collected paintings, polo ponies, and apparently younger wives. She's frightfully composed for a widow. Rather Diana at the funeral, you know." Agatha snorted. "If she's as composed as you say, I'll shake her until something cracks." Roy smiled serenely. "Try not to get us arrested before tea." Clarissa Malvern opened the door herself, a rare courtesy among the wealthy, and all the more disarming for it. She was tall, fragile-looking, with the sort of pale beauty that suggested she'd been bred for soft lighting and subtle tragedy. Her eyes were an elegant shade of fatigue. "Mrs. Raisin, Mr. Silver, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice low and tremulous, like a violin string about to snap. "I feel quite the hostess again." "We won't take much of your time," said Agatha, sweeping in before she could be told otherwise. The drawing room was exactly what Agatha expected, tastefully suffocating. Ivory walls, velvet curtains, and enough silver picture frames to blind a visitor. The air smelled of roses and something sharper, gin perhaps, or fear. "Such a lovely home," Roy murmured, examining the portraits. "Tragic, really, to have all this and no one to share it with." "My husband's memory is quite company enough," said Clarissa. Agatha eyed the crystal decanter on the sideboard, half empty, the glass beside it showing a faint lipstick mark. "You seem to be bearing up admirably," she observed. Clarissa smiled without warmth. "One must, Mrs. Raisin. London adores grief, but only if it's well dressed." "And Julian Fenton helped you with your late husband's collection, I gather." For a moment, Clarissa's expression flickered, too brief for anyone less observant than Agatha to notice. "Yes, Julian was a friend of the heart. He assisted with cataloguing certain works. My husband had a sketch, a Vermeer, nothing monumental but rather special to him." "And it's missing now?" Clarissa hesitated, then nodded. "It vanished shortly before Julian did. I fear he might have been deceived and, or worse, accused of theft." "He was a dealer, not a thief," said Agatha sharply, surprising herself with the conviction in her tone. "Of course," murmured Clarissa, "but in the art world, reputation is as fragile as china." Roy leaned forward, eyes glinting. "You must let me handle the press, darling. I can turn this into a narrative of misunderstood genius and unjust scandal. The widow and the gentleman dealer. Oh, the sympathy we'd milk." Clarissa blinked. "Mr. Silver, this isn't about publicity." "Everything's about publicity," said Roy cheerfully. Agatha elbowed him. "Ignore him. He gets that way when near champagne or sorrow." The widow's hand trembled slightly as she poured tea. "Julian was kind to me after Richard's death. He understood loneliness. That's all anyone truly wants, isn't it? Understanding." Agatha softened, despite herself. Yes, well, I've found men understand everything except women. A ghost of amusement touched Clarissa's mouth. Indeed. As they talked, Agatha's eyes roamed the room. Among the rows of photos, weddings, polo, charity events, one frame was turned face down on the mantel. An oversight or embarrassment? She made a note to remember it. You mentioned Julian's last call, said Agatha casually. Did he say where he was going? He said he was meeting someone, to settle an account. I assumed a client. At what time? Oh, I couldn't possibly recall. You told the police it was 8:30, Roy interjected brightly, scrolling through his phone. It's in the Evening Herald. Clarissa froze, then laughed thinly. Ah, yes, how silly of me. So much has happened. Agatha smiled. Memory's a tricky thing when it's inconvenient. Clarissa's hand trembled again as she set down her cup, the saucer clinking like a small alarm. When they finally rose to leave, Clarissa clasped Agatha's hand. I do hope you'll find out what happened to him. He deserved better than to disappear like that. Agatha nodded. Don't worry, Mrs. Malvern. I intend to find him, one way or another. Outside, the March wind caught them full in the face. Roy pulled his scarf higher, looking like an offended flamingo. Well, he said, wasn't she a fascinating tangle of contradictions? Half saint, half actress. Half bottle short of sobriety, said Agatha. Did you see her hands shake when I mentioned the last call? Maybe she's just nervous. You can be rather forceful. She's hiding something. I can smell it. That might be her perfume. Tragedy by Dior, I should think. Agatha ignored him. And that photo, she turned to the wall. It'll be him. I'd bet my pension. You don't have a pension. Then I'll bet yours. Roy sighed dramatically. So what now, Holmes of the hedgerows? Do we break in and turn it round? Don't tempt me, said Agatha, though the idea appealed more than it should. They paused on the pavement as the taxi approached. Agatha cast one last glance at the townhouse. The curtains had been drawn, but a shadow moved behind them. Long, deliberate, watching. Someone's at the window, she murmured. Roy squinted. Probably the maid. Or the ghost of Vermeer. You're not funny. Oh, I am, he said, climbing into the taxi. You're just cross because she's thinner than you. She's ill, Roy. Exactly. Agatha smacked his arm, but her mind wasn't on him. Something about Clarissa's performance, the tremor, the decanter, the misplaced grief, had rung false. And yet, beneath it, there'd been genuine fear. Back at the curb, she lingered while Roy settled the fare. The wind had shifted, carrying the faint scent of Clarissa's roses. As she turned toward the garden gate, something caught her eye, a movement beyond the hedge. A man in a dark overcoat stood near the wall, half hidden by ivy, a newspaper tucked under one arm. The front page flashed white in the dusk, and she recognized her own face in the grainy photo from the Mayfair gala. Her breath caught. Roy, she hissed. But when she looked again, the man had gone, leaving only the rustle of leaves and a faint echo of footsteps on the pavement. Roy emerged, fussing with his scarf. What is it now? Nothing, she said quickly. Just London being London, full of shadows and liars. He gave her a sidelong look. That's why we love it. Agatha climbed into the taxi, still scanning the street. She didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. Someone was following her, and it wasn't admiration. As the car pulled away, she muttered under her breath, If that's Julian's ghost, he's going to regret haunting me. The morning after her return to Castley dawned with that deceptive Cotswold brightness that promised cheer but delivered chill. The village was washed in sunlight, yet the air still bit at the nose. Agatha Raisin, hunched over her kitchen table with a half-eaten crumpet and a wholly unnecessary sense of grievance, glared at the kettle as though it too were gossiping about her. And in truth, the entire village was. By 10 o'clock, Mrs. Bloxby had appeared at the back door, her expression kind, but her eyes carrying the weary wisdom of someone who knew precisely how much trouble Agatha could manufacture before lunch. I just thought I'd check how you were settling back in, she said. I'm perfectly fine, said Agatha crisply, which was, of course, untrue. You've been in the papers again, Mrs. Bloxby said gently. That photograph of you leaving the Malvern house, it's caused quite the stir. Oh, for heaven's sake, you'd think they'd never seen a woman in a hat before. Some of the villagers were wondering if you'd gone up to London to see that art dealer again. Villagers ought to mind their own blooming vegetables, snapped Agatha. Mrs. Blocksby smiled serenely. I shall take that as a yes. It's a no, said Agatha, or rather a maybe. And anyway, if people must gossip, they could at least wait until I've solved the mystery. You're not solving anything, said Mrs. Blocksby firmly. You're resting. Agatha harumphed. Resting is for corpses, which, by the way, Julian Fenton may very well be. Oh dear, said Mrs. Blocksby, with the sigh of one accustomed to Agatha's particular brand of melodrama. Then perhaps tea will help. By evening, the gossip had brewed stronger than the pub's ale. The Red Lion was humming when Agatha pushed open the door, pretending she had merely come in for a quiet supper. Heads turned. Conversations dipped and re-emerged like guilty fish. She marched to the bar with her best air of unconcern. Pint of bitter, she said. The barman raised an eyebrow. Pint, Mrs. Raisin? Yes, a pint. I've earned it. She carried it to a corner table, feeling eyes follow her. Two women from the parish council whispered audibly about that poor woman and her vanished lover. Agatha's ears, ever alert to insult, twitched. Poor, she muttered under her breath. I'll show them poor. Talking to yourself again? Came a familiar drawl. Charles Fraith stood at her elbow, all charm and creased linen. He deposited a bouquet of tulips on the table. For you, he said. They seemed as bright and complicated as your moods. You're late, said Agatha. I wasn't invited. Then you're early for being uninvited. Charles slid into the opposite chair, signalling for wine. Word travels fast here. Apparently you've been seen prowling about London, interrogating rich widows. Careful, darling, you'll start to sound like me. Agatha took a long, defiant gulp of her beer. You could have told me you introduced Julian Fenton to that Russian collector. Charles blinked. Good heavens, I'd forgotten about that. Years ago. Well, months anyway. And this Russian, what's his name? I don't recall. They all end in ov and begin with money. Look, it was purely business. Julian wanted to sell a painting. I merely opened a door. A door that may have led him straight into a scam, said Agatha sharply. Charles sighed, leaning back. You're implying that I, a humble aristocrat, dabble in criminal art dealings. You're implying you're humble, he grinned. Touché. But I assure you, I've done nothing wrong, unless you count mild charm as a weapon. I've seen you wield it, she said darkly. For a moment, neither spoke. The crackle of the fire and the low murmur of village voices filled the space. Then Charles said softly, You're really worried about him, aren't you? Agatha bristled. Worried? I'm irritated. There's a difference. You're irritated with everyone. That's your resting state. Don't be clever. I'm never clever, just lucky. Usually lucky enough to avoid your wrath. Despite herself, Agatha's lips twitched. You're getting close to it now. He raised his glass. Then I shall drink to danger. Their bickering was interrupted by the shrill buzz of Agatha's phone. She fished it out of her bag, nearly spilling her beer. Bill, what do you want? I'm busy. You'll want to hear this, came Bill Wong's steady voice. Julian Fenton's passport has turned up. Agatha's heart gave a treacherous lurch. Where? In a skip by the Thames, along with a pair of gloves blood-stained. Good grief. We don't know whose blood yet, but the press will soon. I wanted you to hear before it's everywhere. Agatha's mind spun. So he's dead? Not necessarily. It could be staged. You mean he could have planted it himself? Or someone could have wanted us to think that. Either way, stay out of it, Agatha. Stay out of it, when my name's probably about to be dragged through every tabloid between Evesham and Knightsbridge. Precisely why you should keep quiet, said Bill. Let us do our job. You never do it fast enough, she snapped, and hung up before he could reply. Charles was watching her, eyes narrowed in that infuriatingly perceptive way of his. Bad news? They found his passport, she said flatly. And gloves, blood-stained. Oh dear, perhaps he cut himself shaving. Don't joke, Charles. I wasn't. He always struck me as a man who could make even shaving sound scandalous. You're impossible, said Agatha, standing abruptly. If he's dead, I'll find out who did it, and if he's alive, I'll throttle him myself. Charles followed her out of the pub into the cool night air. The moon hung overcastly like a nosy neighbour. Agatha, you can't keep chasing corpses and con men, he said quietly. You'll wear yourself out. Better that than rust away in this village listening to people gossip about me. They gossip because they envy your chaos, said Charles. It's far more entertaining than their marriages. Flattery will get you nothing. Oh, it's not flattery, he said, smiling. It's sociology. She gave him a sidelong glare, but softened slightly. There was something oddly comforting about Charles, infuriatingly unruffled, mildly selfish, but steadfast in his peculiar way. They reached her cottage gate. Charles handed her the tulips again, which she'd left on the pub table. For your kitchen, to remind you of better things than blood and passports. You think flowers can fix everything, don't you? Not everything, but they look prettier than fingerprints. Before Agatha could answer, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Bill. She read it aloud. Don't go looking for trouble, she smiled grimly. He really doesn't know me at all. On the contrary, said Charles, he knows you perfectly. That's why he's worried. Nonsense. Trouble's overrated anyway. She turned toward the gate, then added under her breath, Besides, it always finds me first. Charles's laughter followed her down the garden path, soft, knowing, and just a touch admiring. Inside, Agatha placed the tulips in a jug on the windowsill. Their bright petals glowed against the lamplight, absurdly hopeful. She stood a moment, staring out into the night, where mist curled along the lane like a secret whispered too many times. Somewhere in London, a man was either dead or pretending to be, and she, Agatha Raisin of Carsley, was the only woman foolish enough, or brave enough, to care. She switched off the light, muttering, Let them gossip. At least I give them something worth talking about. The Cotswold sky that morning was a deceitful blue, the kind that promised peace and delivered nonsense. Agatha Raisin sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone like a general considering battle plans. Bill Wong's warning echoed in her head, Stay out of it. Naturally, she had every intention of ignoring him. By noon, she was on the phone to Roy Silver, who was loudly finishing a croissant somewhere in Soho. You want me to be your what? He said between mouthfuls. My London operative, said Agatha, with the tone of a woman recruiting for MI5. Darling, the last time you asked me to help investigate, I nearly got locked in a broom cupboard at the Ritz. That was entirely your fault. You chose to hide. Because you shouted, Act natural, while the manager was accusing us of espionage. Are you in or not? Roy sighed, dramatic as ever. Oh, all right, but if I'm going to risk my freedom, I expect lunch at Claridge's and emotional support throughout. You'll get half of that, she said. That afternoon they met outside a discreet little gallery in Mayfair. Agatha had dressed for the part of a wealthy art buyer. Navy suit, fake pearls, and the kind of haughty disinterest that required real effort. Roy, on the other hand, looked like a cross between a talk show host and an undertaker. Black turtleneck, oversized sunglasses, and a scarf that appeared to cost more than Agatha's car. You look ridiculous, she muttered. Ridiculously convincing, said Roy. No one suspects a man in couture. Inside, the gallery was dimly lit and smelled of varnish, money, and panic. A thin young woman stood behind the counter, clearly new to deception. We're interested in Dutch masters, said Agatha in her best clipped tones, preferably something authentic. I'm weary of reproductions. Indeed, madam, said the assistant nervously. We don't have much on display at the moment. How tiresome. My associate tells me you once handled a Vermeer. Oh, that would have been under Mr. Fenton's management. Agatha raised an eyebrow. Mr. Fenton is no longer with you. He took an extended absence. Meaning he fled, said Roy brightly. The woman blinked. Excuse me. Ignore him, said Agatha swiftly. Tell me who's in charge now. Mr. Fenton's manager, Mr. Lyle, though I believe he's gone abroad, France perhaps. Agatha's instincts prickled. How convenient. Did he leave forwarding details? No, madam, just an empty desk. May I see it? It's quite impossible. Nothing's impossible when one's considering an investment, said Agatha, in a tone that made the woman's spine straighten like a ruler. A few minutes later, they were alone in a small office at the back. The desk, dusty and forlorn, looked as though it had been emptied in haste. Agatha, never one to respect privacy, began rifling through drawers. You do realize this is technically illegal, whispered Roy. So is most progress, said Agatha. In the bottom drawer beneath a stack of catalogues, she found it. A torn invoice, the edges blackened as though someone had tried to burn it. She smoothed it flat. Look, she said, a Vermeer. authenticated by Julian Fenton, dated 3 days before he vanished. Roy whistled softly. So he was working on that painting after all. Or pretending to, and if someone didn't want that known, they might have decided he was surplus to requirements, finished Roy. Agatha slipped the paper into her handbag, ignoring the flutter in her chest. You know what this means, she said, that we're in terrible danger. No, that I was right. You always think that, said Roy. It's your most terrifying quality. Later, over lunch at a tiny bistro, Roy's demand for Claridge's having been diplomatically ignored, Agatha recounted the discovery to Charles over the phone. A Vermeer, you say, he drawled. How terribly old-fashioned of them. Charles, this isn't a joke. Julian authenticated it days before he disappeared, and his managers vanished to France. Doesn't that seem suspicious? Not really. Most people I know disappear to France when the bills arrive. Be serious for once, she said sharply. He sighed. Very well. For what it's worth, I visited Clarissa Malvern this morning. She looked like a ghost who'd been told to smile for the camera. I think she's frightened. Of what? Not of the police. More like someone pulling her strings. Agatha frowned. Blackmail, then. It must tie to the Vermeer, or to Julian, maybe both. Darling, do take care. You have a habit of turning curiosity into calamity. Don't patronize me, Charles. I wouldn't dare. You'd probably solve my murder before the police. She hung up with a snort. Roy watched her thoughtfully. You trust him, don't you? Charles? Of course not. But he's useful when he's not being insufferable. He sounded worried. He always sounds bored. It's his version of emotion. They paid the bill and returned to the street where evening light slanted through the glass shop fronts. Agatha's mind was ticking like clockwork. The widow's fear, the missing manager, the Vermeer's reappearance and disappearance in equal measure. Roy, she said slowly, what if Julian didn't steal that painting at all? What if he found out it was a forgery? Roy blinked. Then someone would have had a motive to silence him. Exactly. And maybe Clarissa's husband before his death was part of it. Darling, you do realize this is turning into a proper conspiracy. Then it's about time someone uncovered it. Preferably someone else. Agatha ignored him, already marching back toward their hotel. Her mind buzzed with theories, each more intoxicating than the last. By the time she'd sent Roy home on the last train, after he'd dramatically insisted that London after dark was no place for delicate creatives, Agatha was exhausted, but restless. She changed into her nightdress, poured a small brandy, and sat by the window overlooking the street. Outside, Mayfair shimmered under a drizzle of gold light, car tires hissing, late diners laughing, the occasional cab sweeping past. It was the kind of scene that looked glamorous from a distance and dangerous up close. She opened her handbag and unfolded the torn invoice again, studying Julian's signature. Neat, precise, confident, as though he'd never doubted his own importance. Yet the smudged ink along the bottom told another story, something rushed, perhaps fearful. "What were you doing, Julian?" she murmured. "And who frightened you enough to make you run?" The knock came at 11:30, soft, deliberate, not the clumsy rap of a guest, but the quiet insistence of someone with purpose. Agatha froze. "Who's there?" No answer. She rose, crossed to the door, and found a plain envelope pushed under it. Her name was scrawled in blue ink. For a moment, she simply stared, half annoyed at the melodrama of it. Then curiosity, as usual, overruled caution. She tore it open. Inside was a single cufflink, gold, engraved with a small letter J. Julian's. She recognized it from the gala, when he'd leaned over to light her cigarette and it had caught the light. There was also a folded scrap of paper. She smoothed it out with shaking fingers. "Stop digging, or you'll join him." Her breath caught. The words were written in block capitals, neat and impersonal, the kind of handwriting that didn't want to be remembered. She looked again at the cufflink, lying innocently on the carpet. A chill crept up her spine. For one brief, illogical moment, Agatha felt something close to grief. Then it hardened into resolve. "Well," she said aloud, her voice tight with defiance, "if they think that'll stop me, they clearly haven't met me." She locked the door, poured another brandy, and sat back in her chair, staring out at the glittering street below. Somewhere, someone thought they could frighten her off. They were about to learn what a very bad idea that was. It was one of those deceptively gentle Cotswold mornings when even bad news felt polite. The rain had given up after a token drizzle, and the lanes outside Agatha's cottage glistened like varnished slate. Inside, however, the mood was anything but pastoral. Agatha Raisin was pacing the kitchen, muttering darkly about liars, aristocrats, and men with expensive haircuts. Charles Fraith lounged at her table, immaculately dressed in tweed and self-satisfaction, sipping the coffee Agatha herself once called undrinkable but efficient. "You've been avoiding me," said Agatha, folding her arms. "Not at all, darling. I've merely been practicing evasive diplomacy." "Don't get clever. You knew about that Vermeer." Charles set down his cup with deliberate care. "Yes, I knew of it. My family owned it once, sold it years ago when taxes and scandal came hand in hand." "To whom?" "Clarissa Malvin's husband, as it happens. Bought it for a song. He was obsessed with status, thought a Vermeer would compensate for his lack of charm." Agatha's eyes narrowed. "And it might have been a fake?" "Quite possibly. The authenticity was always disputed. But the idea of having a Vermeer hung in his study kept him smug until his last day. Julian must have stumbled across the truth." "Then why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because, my dear, I didn't think you'd take it well." "You were right. I'm furious. You're nearly always furious. It's one of your finer qualities. Don't you dare patronize me, Charles Fraith." He smiled, that lazy, dangerous smile that could charm nuns into sinning. "I wouldn't dream of it. But if you're planning to storm Clarissa's next soiree, at least let me send flowers afterwards." "I'm not storming anything. I'm attending, discreetly, with Roy." "Ah, yes, your London operative. Does he still believe subtlety is something that happens to other people?" "He'll manage," said Agatha, though privately she doubted it. That evening she called Bill Wong, hoping for a sensible ally. "You were right," she said without preamble. "Julian was mixed up in something. Art forgery, maybe blackmail." "Agatha, you promised you wouldn't interfere." "No, I promised to try not to. Big difference." Bill sighed. "The fraud network goes deeper than you think. Several collectors, gallery owners, even a few titled families. We're working with Interpol now." "Interpol?" Agatha's eyes gleamed. "I've always wanted to meet someone from Interpol." "You're not meeting anyone from Interpol." "We'll see." "Agatha, I'm serious. This isn't your world." "It is now." She hung up before he could scold her further. Clarissa Malvin's soirees were famed for their elegance and faint whiff of despair. This one, held in her Mayfair townhouse, was no exception. The drawing-room glittered with chandeliers, laughter, and hypocrisy. Agatha entered on Roy's arm, resplendent in emerald silk that hugged her figure a shade too tightly. Roy, in a silver dinner jacket, looked like a misplaced cabaret host. "Darling, this is divine," he whispered. "Everyone here looks fabulously guilty." "Just act natural," hissed Agatha. "I am acting natural, naturally spectacular." Clarissa glided toward them, pale and shimmering in champagne satin. "Mrs. Raisin, Mr. Silver, how delightful." "We couldn't resist," said Agatha sweetly. "After all, art brings people together." Clarissa's smile trembled. "Yes, art. Such a dangerous word these days." "Dangerous?" "In the wrong hands, certainly." Her tone was light, but her eyes darted toward the hallway. Agatha followed her gaze and froze. A man stood half in shadow near the French doors. The same man she'd glimpsed outside the widow's garden. Dark coat, still posture, the air of someone who preferred to watch rather than be seen. "Roy," she murmured, "don't turn your head, but there's a man by the door who's been following me." "How exciting." "It's not exciting, it's sinister." "Same difference. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll strangle you with your own scarf." "Understood," he said cheerfully, and drifted off toward the buffet. Agatha spent the next half hour charming, probing, and eavesdropping in equal measure. From the art dealers she gleaned little but gossip about insurance irregularities. From the aristocrats she learned that everyone detested everyone else's taste. Then she overheard something worth hearing. Two waiters, or rather one waiter and a maid, were whispering in the corridor just beyond the drawing-room. Agatha edged closer, feigning interest in a vase. "He shouldn't be here," the maid hissed. "He said he needed to see her." "If she finds out, we're both finished." The man's voice was low, angry. Tell her I want my share, or next time I'll go to the police." Agatha's heart quickened. She recognized that voice, the same one that had barked orders at the Malvern garden weeks earlier. She stepped forward, but her heel betrayed her with a squeak. The maid gasped, and the man turned, tall, dark, his face half lit by the corridor lamp. Agatha met his eyes for a single, frozen second before he bolted. "Stop!" she shouted, kicking off her shoes. But by the time she reached the front door, he'd vanished into the London night. Clarissa appeared moments later, her expression tight. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Raisin?" "Just a draught," said Agatha, panting. "I chased it out." Roy found her a glass of champagne. "You caused a scene again," he said approvingly. "The staff are whispering that you're an undercover duchess." "I'm about to be an undertaker's client if this keeps up," muttered Agatha. "That man, he's connected, and Clarissa's terrified of him. Perhaps it's an illicit affair. Or perhaps he's part of the fraud. Either way, I intend to find out." "Well, at least you're consistent," said Roy. "Always a step ahead of danger, or a step behind it, depending on the heels." She ignored him and glanced down at her feet. A smudge of dirt streaked the carpet where the man had fled. Something small and metallic gleamed in the fibres. She crouched, pretending to fix her shoe, and picked it up. A valet's tag, embossed with the logo of the Dorchester Hotel. She slipped it into her clutch. "Looks like our friend enjoys five-star hiding places." "You're not going there tonight, are you?" "Of course not," said Agatha. By midnight she was there. The Dorchester's lobby was a cathedral of quiet wealth. The marble floors shone like wet silk, and the air smelled faintly of orchids and overcharging. Agatha approached the front desk, head held high, pretending she belonged. The clerk, a young man with the politeness of the overtrained, greeted her with a smile. "Good evening, madam. How may I assist?" "I'm looking for a Mr. Fenton, Julian Fenton." The smile didn't falter. "Mr. Fenton checked out last week." Her stomach sank. "Checked out? Are you sure?" "Quite sure, though he did leave a message for you." Agatha blinked. "For me?" The clerk produced a small envelope, addressed in Julian's unmistakable hand. Her pulse raced. She took it, fingers trembling slightly. "Did he say when he'd be back?" "No, madam. Only that the message was to be delivered personally, should you inquire." "And no forwarding address?" "I'm afraid not." Agatha slipped the envelope into her handbag, aware of the curious glance from the clerk. "Thank you," she said, managing a brittle smile. Outside, the night had turned cool and quiet, London's pulse softening into the hour before dawn. Agatha hailed a taxi, climbed in, and finally opened the letter. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the sort of script used by people who like to appear in control. "If anything happens to me, trust no one but Charles." Agatha stared at the words until they blurred. The cab's headlights caught the pale reflection of her face in the window. Defiant, uncertain, a woman who wanted the truth even when it hurt. She closed the note and leaned back, exhaling slowly. "All right, Julian," she said softly. "I'll play your game. But if this turns out to be another of your elaborate disappearances, I'll kill you myself." The cab turned toward Mayfair, the city sliding by in ribbons of gold and shadow. Agatha pressed her bag to her lap, feeling the weight of the note, the valet tag, and the faintest tremor of excitement. For all her protests, she loved the chase. Still, as the streetlights flickered across her face, she couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her chest, because for the first time she wasn't entirely sure whose side Charles Fraith was on, or, more dangerously, whose heart he might be protecting. London had a particular way of being cruel in the morning, not through noise or chaos, but through indifference. The rain, a thin, listless drizzle, fell on everyone equally, bankers, beggars, and one infuriated woman from Carsley named Agatha Raisin. She stood at her hotel window, glaring at the folded note on her bedside table. It was written in Julian Fenton's hand, firm, elegant, the handwriting of a man who probably practiced it in school to impress girls. "If anything happens to me, trust no one but Charles." Agatha snorted. "Trust Charles? I'd rather trust a rattlesnake in a dinner jacket." Still, the words clung to her thoughts like burrs. If Julian had truly written them, and it did look like his hand, then why Charles? And if he hadn't, who was trying to stir trouble? Either way, Agatha's curiosity had already drowned out her better judgment. By the time she reached Charles Frayth's flat in Mayfair, her shoes were soaked and her temper set to explode. She was about to pound on the door when it opened from within, not to Charles, but to a uniformed police officer. "Mrs. Raisin?" the man asked. Agatha blinked. "How do you know my name?" "Mr. Frayth mentioned you might appear," he said dryly. "Please wait inside. Inspector will speak to you shortly." Inside, Charles stood pale and composed in the middle of his drawing room. Two detectives moved quietly around him, making notes. The usually tidy space looked dishevelled, a glass overturned, a cushion askew. It took a lot to rattle Charles's immaculate composure, but this had done it. "What's going on?" Agatha demanded. Charles looked up. His voice for once lacked its teasing lilt. "Julian's been found. Found. Dead. In an abandoned building off Dean Street. They think it's poisoning." Agatha froze. The rain, the journey, her indignation, all of it vanished into a single pulse of disbelief. "Poisoning? Not an accident?" "Hardly," said Charles grimly. He didn't look the type to sip cyanide for fun. "You've seen him?" "The police showed me a photograph." Agatha's throat tightened. She wasn't sure if the sensation was shock, sorrow, or the bitter sting of being right. "They found your name in his effects," said one of the officers, stepping forward, "and a letter mentioning trusting Charles. Care to explain?" Agatha glared at him. "I've only just seen it myself." Charles managed a weary smile. "And you came storming over naturally." "I wanted answers," she snapped. "Instead, I find the police in your parlour." "It's been that sort of day," said Charles. Later, after the questioning ended, they sat in silence with two untouched cups of tea between them. Agatha studied him over the rim of her cup. "You look guilty," she said. "I am guilty of knowing dreadful people, but not of murder, before you ask." "You introduced Julian to half this rotten business," she accused. "The Vermeer, the Malverns, it all circles back to you." "You're welcome to your theory, darling. The police have already tried it." "And what did you tell them?" "That I was too indolent to organize a murder," which, frankly, they seemed inclined to believe. Agatha gave a reluctant snort. "I suppose that's true. You'd have someone else do it and charge it to your account." "Precisely. But Agatha, he wrote my name. That letter, it's damning." "Or it's bait," she said. "Someone wanted me to see it, wanted me to doubt you." "You already do," he said lightly. "Yes, but that's just habit," she muttered. By afternoon, Bill Wong arrived at her hotel, his face clouded with official weariness. "You've seen the reports, then?" he asked. "Not officially," said Agatha, "but gossip travels faster than the post. The cause of death was confirmed as poison, traces of aconite, monkshood." "Good grief," said Agatha. "That's the same thing gardeners keep for aphids." "And sometimes for murder," said Bill. "Julian was found with bruising on the wrists. A struggle, perhaps. But it was the poison that did him in." "Who'd use something like that?" "Someone with access to it. Or someone who knew where to find it." Agatha thought briefly of Charles's greenhouse at his manor. Orchids, rare plants, and all sorts of horticultural nonsense. Her stomach turned. "Bill," she said quietly, "where did the aconite come from?" "We're not sure yet. There's talk of a supplier who catered to certain collectors, people who liked exotic species, even toxic ones." "Collectors like Charles Frayth, you mean?" "Agatha, I know, don't interfere. But tell me this, what about Clarissa Malvern?" "Off limits," said Bill flatly. "Her lawyers are circling like hawks. My superiors don't want her touched. Because she's rich. Because she's connected. And her late husband had friends in high places." Agatha crossed her arms. "And those high places are probably where the fraud was run from." "You're playing with fire," Bill warned. "Go home. Leave it alone." "I will," said Agatha sweetly. Bill sighed. He knew that tone. "You absolutely won't, will you?" "Of course not," she said. That evening, back in her hotel room, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Again. For one heart-stopping second, she thought it might be another threat, but the handwriting this time was neat, feminine, and unmistakably kind. "Mrs. Bloxby." Agatha tore it open. "My dear Agatha, I heard about your friend's death on the radio. I do wish you'd come home. The village misses you, even those who'd never admit it. Sometimes, dear, it's best to let the dead rest, and the living forgive themselves. Fondly, Mrs. Bloxby." Agatha read it twice. The gentle wisdom made her throat tighten again. But she wasn't ready to forgive anyone, least of all herself. "Let the dead rest," she muttered. "Not until I've shaken the living." The next morning, she went straight to the police impound, her press badge from an old PR career and a bit of imperious charm granting her entry. The detective in charge, weary and unamused, reluctantly let her view Julian's effects. The items were pitifully few: a watch, wallet, cufflinks, a half-used notebook. She flipped through the pages, finding sketches of paintings, names, prices, all crossed through. The final entry simply read, "Too late now." "Not helpful," she murmured. Then she noticed the evidence bag marked miscellaneous, personal. Inside, something delicate and pale pressed flat against plastic. "What's that?" she asked. "An orchid bloom," said the detective, "found in his pocket. Strange that. Hardly the place for a flower." Agatha stared at it, white with a faint blush of violet at the centre. She knew that flower. She'd seen it only once before in Charles Frayth's greenhouse at Barfield Hall. "Queen of the night orchid," she whispered. "Pardon?" "Nothing," she said briskly, handing the bag back. "Just thinking aloud." But her mind was racing. The same rare orchid, the same plant Charles had once bragged about nurturing from a stolen cutting, and now one of its blooms was found on a dead man's coat. She left the station and walked aimlessly along the embankment, the Thames glinting dull and grey beneath the morning haze. The river smelled faintly of diesel and secrets. Could Charles truly be involved? He'd been evasive before, yes, but not cruel. And yet, Julian's letter, the orchid, the poison. The coincidences stacked too neatly. Her phone buzzed. A text from Charles. "Lunch at the club? You look as though you need it." Agatha stared at the screen, torn between fury and fear. "He's either guilty," she said aloud, "or he's about to charm me out of thinking so." She slipped the phone into her bag and continued walking, shoes clicking sharply on the wet pavement. For the first time in days, her reflection in a passing shop window startled her, not because she looked tired, but because she looked uncertain, and that, for Agatha Raisin, was a far more dangerous thing than rage. That night, back in her hotel, she sat by the window again, watching the city glitter and fade under rain. Somewhere out there lay the truth, buried beneath privilege, deceit, and orchids. She opened her notebook, wrote a single line and underlined it twice. If the bloom came from Charles, then so did the poison. Then she closed the book, took a fortifying sip of brandy and whispered into the quiet, "All right, Charles Frayth, let's see how innocent you really are." Outside, the rain started again, soft, steady and relentless, like the persistence of Agatha Raisin herself. The rain had settled into that weary London rhythm, neither dramatic nor cleansing, simply persistent, as if the city were trying to wash away its secrets drop by drop. Agatha Raisin, meanwhile, was in no mood for cleansing. She was in a mood for blood. Clarissa Malvern sat opposite her in the hotel tea-room, pale as the china cup she clutched. Her fingers trembled, smudging lipstick on the rim. Agatha, who had spent her career reading faces for weakness, knew a breaking point when she saw one. "You might as well tell me," said Agatha crisply. "I already know half the truth, and you'll feel better once I correct the rest." Clarissa's composure cracked. "You think I wanted any of this?" she whispered. "My husband was the criminal, not me." Agatha raised an eyebrow. "And yet you've been paying blackmail." The widow's eyes flicked up wide and wild. "How do you—" "Please. I used to work in PR. I can smell a payoff faster than I can spot a bad perm." Clarissa shuddered. "It was Lionel, Sir Lionel Pembroke. He knew everything about Richard's smuggling ring. The paintings, the fake sales, the forged invoices. After Richard died, Lionel said if I didn't keep the money flowing, he'd see me in prison." Agatha leaned forward, her curiosity sharpening. "And Julian?" "He found out," Clarissa said softly. "He came to me that night, said he'd discovered how Lionel was laundering pieces through collectors abroad. He wanted to go to the police. I begged him not to. He said he'd protect me, that he'd find proof Lionel couldn't bury. The next morning, he was gone." Agatha sat back, absorbing the confession. She should have felt triumph, but what she felt instead was anger. Cold, clean anger at the thought of Julian Fenton, charming fool that he was, dying for trying to do something noble. "You should have told me sooner," Agatha said quietly. I thought you'd think me complicit." "I do," said Agatha, standing, "but only in cowardice. Don't worry, I'm acquainted with that sin myself." Back in her hotel, she rang Charles without preamble. "We're having a party," she announced. "Splendid. Who's the guest of honour, me or my impending disgrace?" "Neither. Lionel Pembroke. You'll invite him to your club. I'll bring Roy and a recording device, and you'll look charmingly useless as usual." "You're planning entrapment?" "I'm planning justice, Charles. It's just better dressed." He sighed. "You do realise Lionel's influence makes the Home Secretary look like a milk monitor. Then he'll enjoy being humbled by a village woman in Marks and Spencer." "Darling, you're terrifying." "Good. Tell him it's a gala, something suitably pompous. I'll handle the rest." Roy Silver arrived in London the next afternoon wearing a pink velvet jacket and nerves. "Darling, are you sure about this? That man looks like he could buy Scotland and sell it back before breakfast." "Then we'll just have to be quicker," said Agatha, fastening a diamond brooch she hoped looked expensive enough to offend Lionel's sensibilities. "And I'm supposed to do what exactly?" "Hide behind a potted palm and record everything he says. You know I loathe plants, they make me sneeze. Then sniff discreetly. This could hang him, or us, depending on how clever you are." "Then we're doomed," Roy muttered. The gala was held in the same Mayfair ballroom where it had all begun. Chandeliers, champagne, and the faint perfume of hypocrisy. Agatha entered on Charles's arm, dazzling in black satin, her chin lifted just high enough to suggest she had every right to be there. Sir Lionel Pembroke stood near the bar, surrounded by admirers. His frame was thick, his smile thinner than paper. Charles approached with the unhurried ease of a man greeting a cobra. "Lionel, old man, still collecting questionable masterpieces?" Lionel chuckled. "Only the best kind, the sort no one dares appraise." Agatha's ears pricked. "How intriguing," she purred, stepping into view. "I've always wondered what drives a man to hoard things that don't belong to him." Lionel turned to her, amused. "Ah, Mrs. Raisin, I've heard of you. The amateur detective with professional delusions." Agatha smiled sweetly. "Oh, I don't mind being underestimated. It makes the victory speech longer." "Victory over whom?" "Why, over men like you. Ones who think charm and a club tie can hide the smell of corruption." A ripple of laughter passed through nearby guests. Lionel's expression cooled. "Careful, Mrs. Raisin. You're treading on dangerous ground. Then I'll wear better shoes," she said. Charles coughed politely. "Perhaps a drink?" But Agatha was already pressing on. "Tell me, Sir Lionel, how large is your collection these days? I hear it's quite priceless." He smirked. "Price is relative, Mrs. Raisin. Some pieces are beyond value, especially those that were never meant to be sold." Behind a potted palm, Roy mouthed, "Got it," into his phone, pressing record. "Fascinating," said Agatha. "And does your taste run more to Vermeer or to blackmail?" Lionel's face hardened. "You've had your fun." "Oh, I'm just beginning." "You think you can slander me in my own circle?" "Not slander," said Agatha loudly, drawing curious glances. "Accusation. Julian Fenton discovered your smuggling network, didn't he? And you silenced him before he could talk." The room stilled. Champagne flutes hovered mid-air. "That's a dangerous statement," said Lionel quietly. "So's murder," said Agatha. Charles shifted uncomfortably. "Aggie, not now, Charles," Lionel's lips curled. "You can't prove a thing." "Not yet," she said, holding his gaze, "but I've always fancied a bit of burglary." The crowd gasped. Someone laughed nervously. Roy sneezed loudly behind the palm, earning a murderous look from the head waiter. Lionel sneered. "You ridiculous woman. Do you think I'd keep evidence lying about?" "Of course not," said Agatha. "You'd keep it where you felt safest, among people too polite to look." He took a step closer. "You'll regret this." "Possibly," said Agatha, "but you'll regret it sooner." The rest of the evening unfolded in chaos. Roy was discovered by Lionel's hulking assistant while trying to adjust his phone. The man seized him by the collar, but not before Roy triumphantly shouted, "Got the whole thing, darling," across the room. Charles intervened, playing the fool with masterful precision. "Oh, good heavens, no violence, please. This is the Athenaeum, not the Colosseum." Agatha, never one to waste a distraction, slipped from the ballroom and into the adjoining corridor, her heart pounding. Lionel's coat was hanging among others in the cloakroom, heavy and conspicuously bulky. She rifled through it, ignoring the disapproving glances of a passing attendant. Inside the inner pocket she found a folded card embossed with gold lettering. Pembroke Fine Acquisitions, Private Viewing, 10 Down Street. She smiled grimly. "There's always another door," she murmured. Later, in the quiet of the hotel bar, Charles joined her, unruffled as ever. "Well," he said, "you've managed to cause a scene that'll keep the gossip columns fed for months." "Good. I'd hate to be forgotten." Lionel's furious. "His solicitors will descend tomorrow." "Then I'd better find that missing painting before they do," she said, draining her drink. Charles studied her for a moment. "You really think he killed Julian?" "I think he ordered it, but I also think someone helped him, maybe even unknowingly." "Meaning me," he said quietly. Agatha hesitated, then softened. "Meaning anyone foolish enough to think they could dabble in corruption and stay clean. You, Lionel, half of London. Take your pick." He smiled faintly. "You've grown cynical, Aggie." "Just observant." Roy appeared, still rubbing his neck. "Darling, if this recording doesn't get us sued, I'll retire in triumph. I got every word, though sadly also every sneeze." "That's fine," said Agatha. "The sneezes add authenticity." "You're impossible," he sighed. "And you love it." She turned back to Charles. "Tomorrow we're breaking into Pembroke's office." "We?" "You owe me, Charles. Besides, I need someone with a key to polite society, and a getaway car." He laughed. "You do realize this is burglary?" "Of course. That's what makes it fun." As they stepped out into the cool night air, the city seemed to hum with secrets. Somewhere out there was the final piece, the painting Julian had died for, the one Lionel thought he'd hidden forever. Agatha looked up at the rain-slicked streetlights and felt a spark of something dangerously close to excitement. She might have been a middle-aged woman from Carsley with a questionable temper and a fondness for gin, but tonight she felt almost heroic. "You really are impossible," Charles murmured as they walked. "Perhaps," said Agatha, "but at least I'm never dull." And with that, she stepped into the dark, her heels clicking like gunfire on the wet pavement, a woman marching straight toward trouble, armed with nothing but determination and very good taste. It was, Agatha Raisin thought grimly, an excellent night for a crime. The moon was veiled behind thin, sullen clouds, and the air had the faint metallic tang of mischief. Somewhere in Mayfair a clock chimed midnight, far too elegant an hour for what she was about to do. "We're going to be caught," hissed Roy, tottering beside her in suede loafers wholly unsuited to burglary. "Only if you keep talking," Agatha muttered, squinting up at Lionel Pembroke's townhouse. The grand Georgian facade gleamed under the streetlights, smug with old money and modern security. Charles Frayth adjusted his cashmere scarf with maddening serenity. "I do hope you're aware this is wildly illegal." "Of course it is," said Agatha. "That's why it's so satisfying." They slipped round the side gate, Charles producing a key, of course he had one, with an infuriating little flourish. The back garden was manicured to perfection, every hedge trimmed to aristocratic precision. "You'd think the man was hiding treasure, not tomatoes," muttered Agatha. "He's hiding both," said Charles. "The tomatoes are imported." "Shut up," she hissed. "Help me with this window." Roy, crouching inelegantly, peered through. "I can see paintings, big ones. Looks like a museum in there." "It is a museum," said Charles, "only with better canapes." The latch gave way with a satisfying click, and Agatha climbed in, landing in what could only be described as a shrine to excess. Paintings lined the walls, gleaming under low lights. A glass cabinet displayed ornaments that looked expensive enough to have their own tax bracket. "Good heavens," whispered Roy. "If the burglars don't get him, the insurance premiums will." "Focus," said Agatha. "We're looking for the Vermeer and that blasted orchid." "You realize, of course," said Charles, trailing after her, "that if we find either, we'll have no idea what to do with them." "Speak for yourself," said Agatha. "I've always had a talent for improvisation." They crept through the gallery, the soft hum of the alarm system a reminder that Lionel trusted technology more than honesty. Agatha's heart thudded. Somewhere between the ridiculousness of it all and the thrill of discovery, she felt almost young again. "Here," she whispered, stopping before a large painting half draped in cloth. She tugged it free and gasped. The light caught the delicate brushwork of a woman by candlelight, soft, luminous, heartbreakingly serene. "The Vermeer," breathed Charles. By Jove, you were right. Of course I was right, said Agatha, though her voice shook slightly. Julian died for this. And now, said Roy, pointing, he's sharing the room with that. On a marble pedestal beside the painting stood an orchid, tall, pale, and strangely sinister under the dim lights. Its petals glowed faintly, white fading to a bruised violet at the edges. Queen of the night orchid, said Agatha softly. The same one from Charles's greenhouse, the same one found on Julian. You make it sound as though the flower's been conspiring, said Charles. Oh, don't be ridiculous, she snapped. Plants don't murder people, but men who name them might. A soft beep broke the silence. What was that? Whispered Roy. Charles looked horrified. The motion sensors, you've tripped them. Me, said Agatha. It's your infernal scarf flapping about. My scarf isn't electronic. Oh, for heaven's sake, both of you. The alarm erupted, a shrieking, metallic wail that made Agatha's teeth ache. Move, she shouted. Roy, grab the painting. I can't carry a Vermeer, he yelped. Then grab the plant. It bites. Charles, muttering something about bloody amateurs, snatched the orchid and dashed for the window. Agatha followed, heels clicking traitorously on the marble floor. They'd barely reached the garden when a voice behind them roared, "Stop where you are!" Lionel Pembroke stood in the doorway, dressing gown flapping, revolver in hand. "You," he thundered, "you think you can steal from me?" "Steal?" said Agatha indignantly. "I'm rescuing stolen goods." "Drop the painting," he barked. "You first," said Agatha, snatching a champagne bottle from a nearby table. "Agatha," began Charles. Too late. She swung with admirable aim and connected squarely with Lionel's knee. He howled, the gun clattering to the floor. "I never liked dry vintages anyway," she said. The orchid toppled from Charles's grasp, landing unceremoniously on the gravel. Roy, shrieking, caught it mid-fall, somehow avoiding both breakage and death. "Oh, marvellous," he gasped. "We're all going to die clutching houseplants." "Not tonight," said Agatha. Sirens wailed in the distance, and not the alarms, but real ones, urgent and approaching fast. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the garden. Bill Wong appeared at the gate, soaked from rain but wearing the sort of expression that could curdle milk. "Agatha," he said wearily, "would you care to explain why I'm arresting you again?" "You're not arresting me," said Agatha, pointing at Lionel, who was now seated on the ground, clutching his leg and muttering obscenities. "You're arresting him. He killed Julian Fenton, poisoned him, then used Clarissa as cover." Bill crossed his arms. "Evidence?" "You'll find his fingerprints on the decanter in her flat, and on that Vermeer, and probably on this plant, if you fancy dusting petals." Charles handed over the orchid like a man surrendering contraband. "And," said Agatha triumphantly, "he just admitted ownership of stolen art. Loudly. Half of Mayfair heard it." Bill sighed. "And you broke into his house. Minor detail. And assaulted him. Necessary self-defense. With champagne. A tragic waste, I agree." Bill pinched the bridge of his nose. "You're impossible." "Efficient," corrected Agatha. "You'll thank me later." The next hour was a blur of statements, flashing cameras, and indignant police officers trying to look dignified while confiscating priceless paintings. Lionel Pembroke was led away in handcuffs, roaring about entrapment and social decline. Agatha stood beside Bill, watching as officers catalogued the evidence. The Vermeer gleamed softly under the floodlights, serene amid the chaos. "So," said Bill in that maddeningly calm tone of his, "care to explain why you thought breaking and entering was the best approach?" "Because it was," said Agatha. "If I'd waited for procedure, Lionel would have shredded the evidence and been halfway to Monaco." "You realize you've technically committed at least 3 crimes tonight." "Oh, don't be so provincial. Charles is a magistrate. He'll smooth it over." Charles coughed delicately. "Actually, darling, I may need to smooth myself over first." Agatha shot him a look. "Traitor." "Realist," he said, smiling faintly. "Besides, you did hit a knight of the realm with a bottle." "A baronet," she corrected, "barely counts." Bill stifled a laugh. "You really do enjoy this, don't you?" "Don't be absurd," she said primly. Then, after a pause, "Well, perhaps a little." By dawn, the rain had softened to mist. The garden was strewn with muddy footprints, empty evidence bags, and the faint smell of triumph. Agatha leaned against the gatepost, heels in hand, watching as officers loaded the Vermeer into a van. Roy joined her, clutching a thermos and looking as though he'd aged a decade. "Darling, next time you suggest an adventure, remind me to fake flu." "You did marvellously," she said. "You even kept hold of the orchid." "Only because I was afraid it would haunt me if I didn't." Charles emerged from the house, hair slightly dishevelled, which for him was the equivalent of public collapse. "Well," he said, "the great Lionel Pembroke will be spending the night in custody, and you, my dear, will be spending it explaining yourself to the press." "I've dealt with worse," said Agatha, slipping her shoes back on. "Besides, they love a scandal with a heroine." "Heroine," he repeated. "That's one word for it. Accessory is another." "Oh, do shut up, Charles. You were magnificent." "Yes, but entirely against my will." Roy sipped his tea. "Honestly, the two of you should marry and save us all the suspense." "Over my dead body," said Agatha. "Quite," said Charles, with a grin that earned him a shove. As the last police car departed, the three of them lingered in the misting dawn, the adrenaline ebbing into weary silence. For all her triumph, Agatha felt that curious post-victory hollowness, the emptiness left when the chase ended and life threatened to become ordinary again. Charles seemed to read her thoughts. "You know," he said, "most people celebrate a solved murder with champagne. You weaponized it." "It seemed appropriate," she said. "And now?" "Now I go home, have a bath, and maybe, just maybe, not get arrested for a while." He smiled. "Unlikely, but endearing." Roy chuckled softly. "You're a legend, Aggie. Scandalous, slightly unhinged, but a legend." Agatha pretended not to be pleased. Well, someone has to uphold standards. When the car dropped her back in Carsley later that morning, the village was still asleep. She paused at her garden gate, the scent of wet roses heavy in the air. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. It wasn't just about catching villains or proving herself, though she'd done both. It was about feeling alive again, about daring the world to underestimate her one more time. Inside, she poured a generous glass of wine, not champagne, but something drinkable, and raised it in a solitary toast. "To Julian," she murmured, "to justice, and to very poor decisions." Her phone buzzed. A message from Charles. "You do realize you've confessed to 3 felonies on tape?" She smiled. "If I'm going to prison," she texted back, "I expect decent wine." And with that, Agatha Raisin, Carsley's most dangerous busybody, leaned back in her chair, content for now, until the next mystery came knocking. Spring had finally surrendered itself to the Cotswolds. The hedgerows were a wild tangle of green lace, lambs bleated across the fields, and even Carsley's gossip seemed to thaw in the sunlight. Agatha Raisin, however, was not feeling particularly pastoral. She stood at her cottage window, frowning at a newspaper headline that read, "Cotswold Sleuth Cracks Mayfair Murder." Beneath it, an unflattering photograph showed her mid-blink, mouth open, as though caught between outrage and indigestion. "Heroine of Mayfair," she muttered. "They make it sound like I was auditioning for pantomime." From the street outside came the faint hum of a lawnmower, a reminder that normal life, other people's anyway, had resumed. Hers, meanwhile, had been reduced to fielding questions from journalists and fending off villagers who alternated between awe and mockery. Mrs. Cartwright from the post office had cornered her the day before, demanding to know if the handsome art thief had proposed before dying. Agatha had glared until the woman retreated behind the greetings cards rack. Now, as she set the paper aside, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Bill Wong holding a brown envelope and his usual expression of weary amusement. "Morning, Agatha," he said. "I come bearing closure." "Oh, good. It's been on my list." He followed her into the kitchen, removing his jacket as though entering a confessional. "Clarissa Malvin's fled to France," he said. "Her solicitors claim fragile health. Lionel Pembroke's awaiting trial. Fraud, murder, blackmail, the usual high society cocktail. And Charles—" "What about him?" she interrupted too quickly. "Cleared of everything. You'll be pleased to know his reputation remains intact, though his club's bar tab may not." Agatha poured tea with unnecessary force. "He'll be unbearable." "He already was," said Bill. That earned him a reluctant smile. "And you?" he asked. "Settling back in?" "Trying to. The village seems determined to turn me into folklore. Better folklore than scandal." "Don't be so sure," said Agatha. "Scandal's livelier." Bill chuckled and rose. You'll miss it, you know. The danger, the excitement. I'll miss a lot of things, she said quietly. He paused, studying her. Julian? Agatha looked down at her cup. He was handsome and hopeless, and I knew he was trouble from the first smile. But for a moment he made life sparkle, and I do like sparkle. Bill's expression softened. You're a romantic, Agatha. Nonsense, she said briskly. I'm just vain. He laughed, left her to her tea, and went off down the lane, the sound of his footsteps fading into birdsong. Later that afternoon, Roy Silver arrived in a burst of cologne and enthusiasm, waving a folded copy of the Mirror. Darling, we've made the front page, he cried. Well, mostly you. I'm mentioned under unidentified associate, which is a travesty. Agatha pretended to roll her eyes, but took the paper. The headline read, Sleuth with Style, Outsmarts Mayfair Murderer. She made a dismissive noise. They could have chosen a better photo. You look marvellous, said Roy. Strong, mysterious, slightly dangerous, like someone who keeps a dagger in her handbag. Don't be ridiculous, she said, though she did read every word twice before folding it neatly beside her chair. So, what's next for our fearless detective, he asked. A holiday? A memoir? A line of perfume called Interrogation? I'm going back to my roses, said Agatha. They don't lie, they don't flirt, and they respond well to pruning, qualities sadly lacking in men. Roy sighed. You're wasted on horticulture. Perhaps, she said, ushering him out. But at least the roses stay where I plant them. As evening settled over Carsley, Agatha sat in her garden with a cup of tea cooling beside her. The air smelled of earth and promise. Around her, the roses she'd coaxed through winter were beginning to bloom, fat buds unfurling into unapologetic colour. She thought of Julian again, of his easy charm and foolish bravado, and wondered if she'd imagined his affection or merely seen what she wanted to. Perhaps it didn't matter. What lingered wasn't lost so much as a faint, wistful gratitude for having felt alive enough to care. Mrs. Bloxby appeared at the gate, her kind eyes framed by the setting sun. "May I?" she asked. "Of course. I was just contemplating my tragic romantic history. There's tea." Mrs. Bloxby smiled and joined her, folding her hands primly. "You've had quite a few adventures lately." "Too many. I'm starting to think the universe mistakes me for a plot device." "And yet you always rise to the occasion," Agatha sniffed. "Pure self-interest. I can't bear being wrong." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Bloxby gently. "You have a good heart, even if you do everything in your power to deny it." Agatha looked away. "I suppose I do miss him. A little. He was a scoundrel, but he made the world seem brighter, until he dimmed it again." "Then remember the brightness," said Mrs. Bloxby, "and plant more roses." "That's your answer to everything." "It usually works," said the vicar's wife, rising. When she'd gone, Agatha sat a while longer, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. The village, in all its nosy, maddening charm, felt steady again. Just as she began to relax, the latch on the gate clicked. Charles Frayth leaned casually against it, looking infuriatingly pleased with himself. "Thought I'd risk a visit," he said. "You're famous now. I felt I ought to pay homage before you forget the little people." "You're hardly little," said Agatha, eyeing him warily. "Flattery, my dear Aggie, at this hour." "Don't call me Aggie." "How domestic you look. Tea, roses, moral superiority. Terrifying combination." "What do you want, Charles?" "To offer an invitation. Weekend at Barfield Hall. Bit of croquet, a few dreadful guests, gallons of wine." "No, thank you," she said briskly. "I've sworn off aristocratic mischief." He smiled lazily. "Pity. You were rather good at it." She hesitated. "What does one wear for croquet, anyway?" "Something impractical," he said. "It's tradition." "Then I'll think about it," she said, pretending indifference. "Splendid. I'll have the butler set aside a mallet for you." "Do," she said, "preferably one sturdy enough to use on men who get in the way." He laughed, tipped an imaginary hat, and strolled off down the lane, leaving her half amused, half exasperated, which she supposed was his natural talent. Agatha turned back to her garden. The last of the daylight brushed gold across the petals. She reached for her secateurs and snipped a perfect rose, inhaling its scent with a sigh that was half melancholy, half satisfaction. "Men may come and go," she said aloud, arranging the flower in a vase, but I'll always prune the thorns first." And with that small, defiant gesture, Agatha Raisin, vain, brave, and ever hopeful, went inside to put the kettle on, ready for whatever nonsense tomorrow might bring.